Winter came and winter went, and the war went on in the same distant way. What page are we on, boys and girls?
134.
We're finishing chapter
10.
The effects of it were real. The rising prices, the shortage of everything, the news, and so had been killed in some faraway battle. But all the things you think of as belonging to a war, the battles and cannons, firing and marching troops and dead and wounded, we hadn't seen any of it, except for the messengers and commissary officers who came by. It got to be the spring of 1777. The work went on, except that instead of cutting wood, cleaning the barn, and pitching hay for the animals, I now spent my day digging and planting in our kitchen garden by the side of the house. So we'd have fresh vegetables for the tavern, and I was doing this one Saturday morning, early toward the end of April, the 26th to be exact, when I began hearing from a long way away a heavy muttering noise. What do you think it is? Predictions. Who has a prediction? Dylan.
Horses.
Horses. Ben.
Cowboys. Oh.
Cohen.
Maybe like a storm.
Could be a storm. Emily?
Maybe father.
Maybe father coming back with a group? Okay. It sounded a bit like thunder.
Yeah.
But not exactly. It made me uneasy. So there's that foreboding feeling again, a little bit of the, what's going to happen, right? It made me uneasy, gives you the inclination of some anxiety. I jammed the spade in the ground and I went out front of the tavern to have a look up and down the road. The sound seemed to be coming from the southwest over behind the church somewhere, but there wasn't anything to be seen. And then I saw Ned, Samuel Smith's Negro, come running up the road. At the same moment, Captain Betts popped out of his house next door. Captain Betts was in the rebel militia. "What is it, Ned?" he shouted. "British troops, Captain," Ned shouted. He ran on by. Captain Betts turned back in the doorway. "Jerry," he shouted, "quick, get Mr. Rogers here." Jerry Sanford dashed past him through the door and up the road toward the Rogers. Captain Betts continued to stand there for a moment more, listening. "What do you think they're doing, Captain Betts?" I called. He looked grim. Grim. Synonym. Synonym for grim. He looked grim. Edward. Maybe
Serious?
Maybe serious.
Yeah.
Serious is a better description. He looked grim. "It won't be anything good. There are a lot of them." "Is the militia going to try to stop them?" "There aren't enough patriots in Reading to stop a pair of cows going through." And then he went back into his house. I turned and I went into the tavern. Mother was scouring some pots. "British troops coming. What do you think they'll do? Drink and not pay for it? That's the rule with soldiers. Now go take the good pewter out to the barn and hide it in the hay." I did it, and then I ran back around to the front to watch the soldiers come. Now I could see a fine shading of dust in the air out behind the church, rising slowly and drifting away. The noise grew louder. I watched, and all at once, through the hedgerows, I caught a glimpse of movement and things flashing. In a moment, the vanguard appeared around the bend. There was a drummer boy banging away in front, and a standard bearer, and then a couple of officers on horseback. And then the marching men. On down the road toward me they came. It was frightening to see. They just kept coming, on and on, as if nothing in this world could stop them. Bottom page 136. Now I could see cannons, each of them about 12 feet long, drawn by 2 horses. I figured they must be 6-pounders from what I'd read about. Behind them were wagons full of boxes and bags, powder and balls and such, I figured. The dust rose up through everything, turning the red uniforms, the cannons, the wagons, all a grayish brown. They marched past the tavern, pulled off into the training ground, and broke formation. Mr. Rogers ran by with Jerry Sanford coming behind him as fast as they could. They dashed into Captain Bett's house. I hope they weren't trying to get the train band organized to fight the British. That was impossible. There were hundreds of redcoat milling around on the training ground, maybe thousands even. Most of the people in the village were standing in their yards watching. The children kept dashing up the road to the training ground to get a closer look until their mothers saw them and dragged them back home again. In the training ground, the soldiers were settling down to eat breakfast, dumping their packs on the ground, and stacking their muskets into neat little teepees, 4 or 5 together. I kept hoping that some of the officers would come into the tavern for rum or beer or something to eat. I wanted to see them close up and listen to them talk. Oh, those troops were impressive looking with all of those belts and buckles and powder horns and bayonets and so forth dangling about their red uniforms. How could people like Sam expect to beat them? But the officers didn't come into the tavern. Instead, 3 or 4 of them rode up to Mr. Heron's house. I saw Mr. Heron open the door and let them in, and they disappeared. I guess that Mr. Heron had known in advance that they were coming. Probably he had set out breakfast for them. It gave me a funny feeling to realize that while Mr. Heron was giving the British officers rum and beef, Captain Betts and Mr. Rogers were sitting in the Betts house 100 yards away, trying to figure out ways to kill them. I went on watching. Some of the bigger children had got away from their mothers and were standing at the edge of the training ground, looking at the soldiers. After a while, the children began shouting questions at the men like, have they ever killed anybody? And weren't they afraid of the rebels? And so forth. The soldiers joked back with the kids, and after a while, I walked over myself and I listened. Where are you headed for? I asked one of the redcoats. If I knew, I wouldn't tell you. He's had a funny accent. Where are y'all from? Where are you from, lad? Right there. And I pointed to the tavern. Well, I'm from Dublin, and I wish I was back there right now instead of marching through this bloomin' place. Well, what's Ireland like? Oh, it is a lovely place. All green and cool like if you don't mind a spot of rain. How is it you're not afraid of us, you tykes? We're mostly Tories here. And suddenly, I realized that I was. Father's capture had done that. What does he mean, father's capture had done that?
Like,
his father capture admitted
that's
that.
what made him like get that strong feeling that he was changing.
Well, right, but what made him feel like now he's a Tory instead of a rebel? Tate.
Because the Cowboys were patriots.
Right, and he thinks it's the fault of the patriots or the rebels that his father is missing, possibly dead. So that confirmed his stance, and he is on the loyalist side. He said, and I would have talked with him some more, but just then an officer came riding and shouted, "Get along, you bloody Yankee scum! Back to your mothers!" And he slapped the quirt on his leg, and we all ran. I stood in our yard watching. The officer shouted something to the soldiers. There was a scurrying around, and then 8 of them snatched up their guns, formed up in twos, and marched out behind the officer. He wheeled his horse about, and he trotted toward me. I jumped back, and I plunged for the tavern doorway. He galloped across our yard into the Betts yard, pulled the horse up, and shouted some more orders. The soldiers charged for the Betts door, bashed it open with the butt of the end of their rifles, and slammed into the house. 5 minutes later, they came out again, pushing in front of them Captain Betts, Mr. Rogers, and Jerry Sanford. Jerry was dead white. He was trying not to cry, but the tears were squeezing out of his eyes, and he kept wiping his face with his sleeve. The soldiers pushed the 3 of them onto the road, tied their hands behind their backs, and marched them into the training ground through the troops. I knew now what the officers had gone up to Mr. Heron's for. It wasn't breakfast. It was to find out who the rebel leaders were. Now, my mother was standing in the doorway beside me. The brutes, what do they want with that little one? Can they think he's dangerous? What are they going to do with him, Mother? God have mercy on them. God have mercy on William Heron. They wouldn't shoot Jerry, would they? War turns men into beasts. It's cheaper to shoot a boy than to feed him. I don't think they would, Mother. I don't think they'd shoot Jerry. It seemed unbelievable. But it made me go all cold all the same. She shrugged. Maybe not. Only the Lord knows about that. Come into the house before they take a fancy to you. Who knows what Mr. Heron's told them about your brother? I'm all right, Mother. Come into the house, Timothy. I've lost two. I'm not losing another. I went in. I was full of all kinds of funny feelings. At first, when the troops had arrived, swaggering around so bold and gay, I had really admired them. But seeing them take Jerry Sanford off like that gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. I didn't think they'd shoot him. I figured they'd take him away just because he lived with Captain Betts and happened to be there when the soldiers had come. But still, maybe they would shoot him. Maybe they'd want to torture him for secrets or something. After all, he lived with one of the rebel leaders and might know what their plans were or whether they had ammunition stored someplace. Okay, stop there.
No, it's still going.
No, will you stop it, please?